Welcome back for part 2 of this series, Crashing Locomotives for Show. Part 1 ended with the first successful locomotive crash for show near Lancaster, Ohio, on May 30th, 1896. That success brought a wave of publicity across the country and a number of requests for additional collisions. Dates for staged wrecks were made in Illinois, Iowa, Texas, Indiana, Colorado, and Missouri. Alfred Streeter formed a company to handle and manage these requests, which some newspapers called the Chicago Special Attraction Company. The cost to put on a staged locomotive collision varied, but the average was around $7,500, or about $282,000 today. At each event site, a tall canvas wall was put up to enclose the crash site. Wire netting could also be put up near the expected collision point to protect people from flying metal. Finally, Streeter purchased tents and seats for the crowd and hired local bands for entertainment. Since Streeter had wanted to host a locomotive collision in front of a large crowd at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, it was natural that he picked Chicago for his next crash on July 4th. Chicago officials were still wary of Streeter's idea, and they refused to allow him to host a collision within the city limits. Therefore, the event was held at Cicero, more of a suburb in those days. More specifically, the event would be held on the Chicago and Northern Pacific Railroad line at its Lowry station, at the intersection of Ridgeland Avenue and 16th Street. Both locomotives used in the crash were from the Illinois Central. Locomotive 100 had been used to haul passengers to the 1893 World's Fair and was built in 1870. Locomotive 99 had served on a southern division of the Illinois Central. For the crash, each locomotive pulled 5 freight cars and a caboose. The event was advertised heavily in the Chicago newspapers as a once-in-a-lifetime event. The Chicago Chronicle published drawings from the Buckeye Park crash, as did the Chicago Tribune. Pictures or drawings in newspapers were still fairly rare in 1896. The railroad charged 75 cents to transport people to Lowry Station, which would be about $28 today. Streeter spent about $10,000 for the show, including $1,000 for each engine. That would correspond to about $366,000 today. Streeter decided not to use dummy engineers and firemen this time, as some people at Buckeye Park had thought they were real. On show day, 20,000 people turned out to watch the collision. Although this was a big number, Streeter was really hoping for upwards of 100,000. At 4:51 p.m., the opposing locomotives met head-on. The noses of the locomotives rose 10 feet in the air, toppled over, followed by a huge cloud of dust and steam. Here is one drawing of the aftermath of the collision. This is the same drawing, only a little closer. Once again, relic hunters sprang into action, picking through the wreckage for souvenirs. While the boilers were still hot, men climbed on them and broke off any piece of metal they could. Men and women also combed the surrounding area for pieces of wreckage. The onslaught on the wreck continued for 2 hours. The place sounded like a boiler factory, with all the hammering from the relic hunters. If all 20,000 people paid 75 cents each to view the collision, that would be about $15,000. Since Streeter had put up about 10,000, that would be a profit of about $5,000, or $183,000 today. For his part, Streeter was paid a commission of $2,000, the equivalent of $73,000 today. Streeter wanted another try at luring in a large Chicago crowd, so his next planned collision was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Pullman Station, a southwest suburb of Chicago on the Illinois Central, was selected as the location. The actual point selected for the crash was the 104th Street Station. Locomotive 101 was named the William McKinley and was called the Gold Standard. Locomotive 102 was named the William Jennings Bryan and was called Free Silver. McKinley was the Republican nominee for president in 1896, and Bryan was the Democratic nominee. At the time, the country was debating a gold standard versus a free silver economic policy. The gold standard pulled 2 cattle cars and 1 boxcar, and the free silver pulled 3 boxcars. Streeter again heavily advertised in the Chicago newspapers, stating the show would occur rain or shine. The railroad fare and admission price were fixed at 75 cents. However, contrary to the stated plan, rain postponed the made-to-order collision. The event was pushed back a week to July 25th. This allowed Streeter more time to advertise the collision. Speaking of advertising, it was done similar to the Cicero event, featuring drawings of the Buckeye Park collision. The 2 smashed locomotives standing up together attracted a lot of interest. Streeter expected to draw a lot of the same people who had been at Cicero, as many of them had turned away from the collision at the last moment, never actually seeing it. An enclosure 1,600 feet long and 200 feet wide was built around the collision site, with a grandstand in the middle. Streeter was hoping for a crowd of at least 60,000 people. However, sources say the crowd was somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 in size, so we will say about 5,000. The start to the event was delayed by the arrival of a deputy sheriff, who was sent to obtain money for one of Streeter's financial backers. While that matter was being settled, both trains stood nose to nose, allowing people to inspect them close up. At 5:05 p.m., the trains were backed up to their pre-planned starting points. The roofs of nearby houses were covered with people who were hoping to catch a glimpse of the crash. All the telegraph poles in the area held swarms of boys. The engines met head-on at the planned point at 5:15 p.m. The wreck fell to the west, and the track was torn up for a long distance. This is a photograph of the wreck from one news publication, and this is a drawing of the crash that appeared in the Chicago Chronicle. Despite the low attendance, the event was considered a success. If 5,000 people paid the 75-cent fare and entry fee, that would equate to about $3,700. With the average cost of a made-to-order collision said to be $7,500, that would mean the event lost money. New York City planned the next made-to-order locomotive collision on August 8th. The Brighton Improvement Company was the promoter of the event. Brighton Beach was located on Coney Island. There were large hotels on the beach with beautiful landscaping and walking paths. Again, the promoters saw the crowds of people who were drawn to Coney Island and figured a made-to-order collision would be easy money. Several New York City newspapers had sent reporters to the Buckeye Park collision and had printed drawings of the crash in their papers. The promoters thought they could attract 100,000 to 500,000 people to such an event, and set the admission at $1 a head. However, the hotel and resort owners did not know how they could accommodate such a large crowd, so the event was canceled before too much planning had actually occurred. Alfred Streeter was soon back at it, staging his next made-to-order collision at Corydon, Indiana, on August 26th. Corydon was not far from Louisville, Kentucky, on the Louisville, New Albany, and Corydon Railroad, in Harrison County, Indiana. The town of Corydon was fairly small, about 1,500 people. However, it did host the Harrison County Fair on the southwest edge of town. The fair's main attraction in 1896 was the staged locomotive collision, which was not actually held on the fairgrounds, but on the spur to the stone quarries. The crash location was about a mile from the fairgrounds, which meant the fair was pretty much deserted when the collision was held. Two old locomotives from the Corydon Railroad were used in the collision. The Fair Association had contracted with Streeter to host the collision. The attraction was advertised extensively all across southern Indiana and nearby Kentucky. The admission to the made-to-order collision was set at 50 cents. 10 acres of land along the track were enclosed by a 20-foot-tall canvas fence. Inside, a rope fence kept the crowd about 200 feet away from the track. The advertising worked as hundreds of people traveled on excursion trains from all the nearby towns and cities. As planned, the two locomotives slammed together with a terrific crash at about 5 p.m. The panting and blowing continued for about 2 or 3 minutes, which was followed by an absolute silence. The crowd soon recovered, cheered, and then rushed toward the wreck, looking for souvenirs. The Corydon Fair Association was very pleased with the results, calling it the greatest day of the fair. Nearby newspapers printed glowing headlines about the event, calling it the greatest day of the year for Corydon. Just a few days later, in early September, Streeter's next made-to-order collision was set at Columbus, Ohio. Columbus was located in central Ohio on the Columbus, Sandusky, and Hocking Railway. Columbus should sound somewhat familiar, as Streeter's first successful locomotive collision had occurred just southeast of Columbus at Buckeye Park. The Columbus head-on wreck would be staged near the Ohio State Fairgrounds along the railroad line. There, an area 1/2 mile long by 1/4 mile deep was staked off along the track and surrounded by a 14-foot wall of canvas. Plans were made to accommodate 100,000 people, and a grandstand with seating for 10,000 was erected. One locomotive was named the McKinley, with the words "Gold Standard" painted on it. The other locomotive was titled the Bryan, with free silver on the side. In the windows, likenesses of both presidential candidates were added. For this crash, each locomotive would pull 3 coal cars and a caboose. To advertise the collision, Streeter included his well-known collision drawing with the ads. One newspaper added their own twist: "See 'em hit." Although well planned, Mother Nature did not help. Rain fell in torrents nearly up to the time of the collision. Therefore, only 5,000 people waded through the rain to see if the event would actually occur. As the rain finally stopped, the made-to-order collision did occur, and the cars were telescoped together. But neither the cabooses were damaged in the least. Debris was hurled many feet from the collision point, but since the crowd had been held back, there were no injuries. As was typical, the crowd charged the wreck scene to look for relics. 2 boys took great delight in ringing the bells on the engines, which had not come off during the collision. It was said that old-time railroad men, who had been through other wrecks, were completely unnerved by the sight. All kinds of relics were carried away, from the steam whistles to small splinters of wood. Des Moines, Iowa was the next city to host a made-to-order locomotive collision, with Joseph S. Connolly as the promoter. Connolly was from the Des Moines area and would have been 37 years old in 1896. The collision was part of the Iowa State Fair and would use old locomotives from the Des Moines Northern and Western Railroad. The crash was held at the State Fairgrounds in East Des Moines. Locomotive 12 was named the Gold Bug, while Locomotive 13 was labeled the Silver Bug. Again, this was in reference to the 1896 presidential election. Gold or silver bug pins were actually being sold, so a person could show their support for either candidate. The Gold Bug was for McKinley, while the Silver Bug was for Bryan. Both engines were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The fair and its planned locomotive collision were well advertised across Iowa. Connolly was hoping to draw the largest crowd in fair history for the crash. Some of the initial estimates placed the crowd size at the made-to-order collision at 75,000. After the collision, the whistle on the Silverbug blew for 5 minutes. However, once the tickets were counted, less than 40,000 people had actually attended. The final count showed about 36,000 people had entered the grounds, paying about $20,000 in admission fees. For his work, Connolly was paid $3,000, or about $110,000 today. Connolly also made money selling photographs of the crash. Connolly would later become known as Head-On Joe, as he staged 73 head-on train wrecks between 1896 and 1932. That concludes part 2 of this series on staging head-on locomotive crashes for show. Stay tuned for part 3 of this series, the final made-to-order crashes of 1896. That concludes the video. Make sure to check out my other YouTube videos and my primary website at mnbricks.com.